Hello everyone, Mrs. Below here. In this video, I'm going to be going over the Part 3 Ecology Notes, slides 1 through 6, which is about limiting factors, density dependent and density independent limiting factors. Okay. But before I get to that, I do want to mention some vocabulary. So native and non-native species and invasive species. So a really good example of a non-native species was in Australia. There was a rabbit that was from Europe, and it was introduced to Australia. Now, a non-native species means like that species isn't native to that area. It doesn't originate from that area. So in Australia, they introduced this rabbit, came over from Europe, and usually this is from people doing this, humans accidentally or purposefully bringing in animals from one area to another, and then that animal getting into the ecosystem and kind of wreaking havoc potentially. So the rabbits were considered again, non-native species, meaning they weren't native to that area, the Australian ecosystem. However, they had wreaked havoc on the Australian ecosystem. So they were doing as bunnies do. They were reproducing rapidly and kind of started to take over. They would damage the ecosystem. They were eating and consuming a lot of the food there. And when this happens, when a non-native species starts to have a large negative impact on the ecosystem, it then becomes what we call an invasive species. So again, this can happen usually because of humans. Another example is the Burmese python. This is native to, I believe, Asia. These, so far west, not from the United States, or far east, excuse me, not in the United States. And these animals were released into the Florida Everglades. Again, it was probably somebody that had it as a pet and didn't want to keep it anymore, released it into the wild, and then they could start to wreak havoc, competing with other native species, potentially driving them out and causing an imbalance in the overall ecosystem. Just a little information on that. Next, I want to talk about the main thing here, which is limiting factors. So normally in an ecosystem, there are limiting factors. These are things that keep population size down, okay? So it prevents things from getting out of control, okay? And again, we're going to be talking a lot about populations here, which if you remember back to the levels of organization or hierarchy, that's the same species living in an area, okay? And there are two types of limiting factors, density dependent and density independent. Again, these are things that prevent species from growing out of control, okay? And again, sometimes when we have a non-native species that becomes invasive, unfortunately, those limiting factors aren't really doing too much for us. But in a normal ecosystem, there are these things in place to keep those native species from getting out of control. And a lot of these you are already familiar with. So density dependent limiting factors. So this is dependent on the density or the number of individuals in a given area for a particular species, okay? So remember, an individual organism. So examples include competition. So organisms compete with each other, and depending on how much they have to fight for resources, that depends on how many other individuals are they competing with in that area. So when you have other individuals that you have to compete with for resources, That's going to keep the population size down. Predation is another example. Again, both of these are examples of ecological relationships that we talked about in part 1. Predator-prey relationships, we talked about that before, how those two relationships oscillate, or they can fluctuate in response to each other. So the predators prevent the prey from getting out of control, but then the prey also prevents the predators from getting out of control. So their numbers are dependent on each other. So this is why it's a density dependent limiting factor. And then another example, this was a parasitism. This was an example of a symbiotic relationship. So parasites, those can also keep a population size down, right, by weakening organisms or potentially killing them, depending on the type of parasite. And usually if organisms are closer together, which is, the density piece, then the disease can spread more quickly sometimes. So these factors depend on how many individuals you have in that area, and however many individuals are in that area, that impacts like how many potentially can live there. And again, usually this keeps population sizes down because either organisms are competing with each other, competing for prey, or potentially being harmed or even killed by parasites. So I would like you for this slide here to watch the video and answer the questions. It's a really interesting video. The link for that, if you go into the content library and you go under helpful videos, helpful ecology videos, you want to scroll down to this video right here. It is about one of the world's longest predator-prey relationship studies about the moose in Isle Royale, which is located, it's a secluded island, I believe, in Michigan. Very interesting. Here's that graph actually, and this is real data of that study. And then it talks about, the normal predator-prey relationship, how that was happening, and then there's some stuff that actually started to go wrong, and they'll explain that in the video. So watch that video and then do your best to answer these questions, and we'll go over this when I get back. So this would be a predation example, and that would be density dependent. Lastly, I have density independent limiting factors. So typically there are things that can happen in an environment that can affect the population's growth regardless of how many there are. So this is independent of how many species are living in an area. So these examples include unusual weather. So maybe there is a drought, maybe there's fluctuations in the temperature, really high or really low. There could be a natural disaster, tornado, hurricane, a forest fire, human activity, so pollution, deforestation. It's a really sad image of a bird that contains plastic that must have eaten that plastic, so pollution. So these things are independent of how many individuals are living in that area. These factors don't depend on how many individuals are present. So now that you've filled out your notes, and again, make sure you watch this video. Again, the link is right here under helpful videos. You got to scroll down in the content library, watch that video, answer the questions. And then you're going to complete the limiting factors and carrying capacity worksheet. So this is very straightforward because there are videos, so reinforcing what we just talked about. And then also a little introduction to carrying capacity, which we will talk about when I get back.